Captain James Riley stepped off the Greyhound bus wearing worn boots and a face carved by war. His duffel bag hit the pavement with a heavy thump, and beside him, Odin leapt down gracefully, alert, calm, and utterly loyal. The small town of Fairview sat nestled in the lap of green hills and rusting fences, unchanged on the outside, but strangely hollow to James now. The war hadn't followed him back, but it hadn't left him either. It had been 3 years since he'd last walked these streets. Fairview was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, especially if you were a war hero. And James was exactly that. 2 deployments, a silver star, and a chest full of wounds no medal could ever patch. But today no parade awaited him. Just the low hum of tires on old pavement and the occasional nod from passers-by pretending not to stare. Odin's ears flicked back. He was picking up on the tension before James did. A woman at the gas station did a double-take and smiled, but her eyes betrayed something else. Pity, maybe. Fear. James wasn't sure anymore. They walked the 2 miles to his newly rented cabin on the edge of the forest. James had bought it sight unseen, a fixer-upper sold cheap by an old widow who'd moved to Florida. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the weeds had taken over the yard. James didn't mind. It was quiet, and that was enough. The cabin sat on 5 acres of land, backed by a thick forest of pines that led to the hills. The silence was absolute, the kind only rural towns could provide. James dropped his bag inside and looked around. No TV, no internet. Just wood floors, old windows, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. Odin did a perimeter check, as if he knew this would be home now. He sniffed the corners, checked the rooms, then returned to James and sat at attention. "You still got it," James said, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. Odin leaned into his hand. The bond between them went beyond training. Odin had saved James more than once. Once, in the middle of a night raid gone sideways in Afghanistan, Odin had pulled him out of the rubble after an IED took out their Humvee. James had lost 3 men that day. Odin had lost his handler, and from then on, they had belonged to each other. Later that evening, James sat on the porch, a mug of black coffee in his hands, and Odin sprawled out at his feet. The town was so quiet it made his ears ring. In the distance, someone was chopping wood. A dog barked once, then silence. Returned. He didn't feel at home, not yet. Maybe not ever. A truck drove by slowly. The driver stared as he passed, then kept going. James's eyes narrowed slightly. Probably nothing. Just a neighbor wondering about the new guy. Still, his military instinct didn't let it go. Odin noticed too. He lifted his head and gave a low, nearly inaudible growl. "Easy, boy," James murmured. "No fight here, not yet." The next day he went into town to buy supplies. As he walked into the hardware store, conversations paused. A few people approached him. "Captain Riley." "God bless you," said Mr. Morgan, the store owner. "You let us know if you need anything. Your dad would be proud." Others were less forthcoming. A couple of city councilmen exchanged uneasy looks when they saw him. One nodded stiffly, another simply walked away. It didn't take much to sense something was off. Something simmered under the surface. By the time he left town, James knew this wouldn't be the quiet life he'd hoped for. As they reached the edge of the forest trail leading back to the cabin, Odin stopped suddenly. He stared into the trees. Muscles tense. "What is it?" James asked. Odin didn't bark. He just watched. James followed his gaze. There was nothing there. No movement. No sound. But James trusted his dog more than he trusted most men. Something or someone was out there, and Fairview wasn't going to let him stay invisible for long. The days following James's return settled into a rhythm, repairing the cabin by day, walking with Odin at dawn and dusk, and keeping mostly to himself. But as the rhythm settled, the unease grew. It started with a trip to the old Veterans Center. The building stood on the edge of town, across from the old train depot, now shuttered and tagged with graffiti. The place had once been alive with support meetings, job help, and shared stories that made the weight of war feel lighter. Now the windows were boarded up. A rusted sign hung crooked over the door, "Closed indefinitely. Contact County Services." James tried calling the number. Disconnected. A few doors down, he stopped at the diner. Inside, the usual mix of old-timers and truckers sipped coffee. The air smelled like bacon and burnt toast, just like it had when he was a teenager. He slid into a booth and asked the waitress, Sandy, what had happened to the center. She paused. Budget cuts, they said, happened fast. People protested, but the council wouldn't budge, said it wasn't being utilized enough. James frowned. I thought it was full most days. It was, but none of that mattered. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Charlie tried to fight it. His heart paused at the name. Charlie Kincaid. Yeah, he got loud about it. Started digging into where the funding went, then he just left town. She looked over her shoulder. Or so they say. James didn't believe that for a second. Charlie was a Marine, sharp, stubborn, and deeply loyal to his fellow vets. He wouldn't just leave without saying something, especially not to James. They'd gone through the worst together in Fallujah. He still had a photo of the two of them, beer in hand, the desert behind them. If Charlie had found something shady, he'd dig until someone shut him up. James stepped outside, his eyes scanning the street. The town looked normal, too normal. Neat lawns, clean storefronts. But there was a stillness, like people were pretending. Nothing was wrong, and that's what scared him the most. Later that afternoon, James visited the town hall, hoping to pull public records, anything on the budget decisions. A young woman at the front desk smiled tightly. Sorry, those files are under review right now. Mayor's orders. Under review, James asked. Is that standard procedure? She gave a nervous shrug. It is now. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Councilman Rick Trenton stepping out of the side office. Trenton had been a real estate guy before he got into politics, a loudmouth who once tried to buy up half the town. Now he was on the council, and he looked genuinely surprised to see James. Riley. I didn't realize you were back, Trenton said, extending a hand James didn't shake. Just getting settled, James said, his voice calm. Heard the center's gone. Thought I'd find out why. Trenton's smile faltered. Unfortunate. Business. Hard decisions had to be made, nothing personal. Didn't seem like it. Trenton gave a short chuckle, but his eyes didn't. Let sleeping dogs lie, Captain. No need to go stirring things up when you're just getting home. James held his gaze. Depends what's buried. Back at the cabin, Odin was pacing at the edge of the trees again. Same spot as before. James approached slowly. Something out there? Odin growled, low, deep. Then sat, watching the woods like a soldier on perimeter duty. James stood beside him, arms crossed. The feeling was back, something crawling up his spine, a sense he'd learned never to ignore. That night, James bolted the door, loaded his pistol, and set Odin's water near the bed, not because he was afraid, but because something about Fairview wasn't right. The town had secrets. Charlie had tried to uncover them, and James had a feeling he was about to find out why no one else ever came back asking questions. The wind whistled through the pines as James drove home that night. The air was thick with the smell of rain and pine sap, the kind of heavy silence that settled over the forest just before a storm. Odin sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, gaze fixed out the side window. He was tense, more alert than usual. James noticed. You feel that too, he muttered, keeping one hand on the wheel and the other near the pistol holstered under his jacket. Odin didn't respond, but James didn't need him to. The dog's instincts had saved his life more than once overseas, and they hadn't dulled since. The narrow gravel road twisted through the trees, moonlight casting flickering shadows between the branches. It was almost midnight, the kind of time when most people in Fairview were long asleep. James rounded a bend and saw headlights appear suddenly in his rearview mirror. High beams, too close. Damn it, he whispered. The truck behind him revved its engine. James recognized the sound, heavy-duty modified exhaust, like the kind backwoods contractors used. The truck surged forward and rammed the back of James's pickup. The impact jolted him forward. Odin let out a sharp bark. Another hit, harder this time, sent the truck skidding sideways into the ditch. Tires shrieked as James fought the wheel to regain control. Gravel flew. His truck slammed against a tree, the airbag bursting open in a blast of white fabric and burning chemical smoke. Dazed, James shoved the airbag aside and reached for his pistol. He'd barely unlatched his seatbelt when he saw them, 2 men in masks, jumping out of the truck behind them, charging forward with flashlights and batons. Odin didn't wait for a command. The German Shepherd launched from the passenger window with a furious snarl, hitting the first attacker mid-sprint. The man screamed as Odin's jaws clamped down on his arm. They both hit the ground hard, Odin on top, snarling and tearing. The second man rushed to the driver's side, yanking the door open. James was ready. He slammed his fist into the attackers. Wrist, knocking the baton away, then cracked the butt of his pistol into the side of the man's head. The man dropped with a grunt, motionless. Odin stood guard over the other, who was now bleeding and whimpering on the ground. The first attacker scrambled to his feet and bolted into the woods, leaving his partner behind. Breathing heavily, James stepped back, weapon trained on the unconscious man. Odin stayed low, growling, his teeth bared. Blood stained his snout. But his eyes remained sharp and focused. Sirens were absent. There was no help coming. James searched the downed attacker and found nothing. No ID, no phone. Just a burner radio and gloves. Too professional for a simple mugging. Back in town, James filed a report with the local sheriff's office. He described the truck, the assailants, the crash. The next morning, the report was listed as vehicular. Incident, no suspects. No patrols were dispatched, no further questions were asked. When James pushed for more, the sheriff, a man he'd known since high school, met his gaze with something close to fear. "Listen," he said quietly. "If I were you, I'd let it go. You're back alive with a good dog and a clean slate. Don't stir it." James stared at him. "So I just pretend I wasn't nearly killed on a back road?" The sheriff rubbed his temples. "Some things around here ain't what they're used to be. That's all I'll say." Outside the station, James tightened Odin's leash and walked straight to the edge of town. The leaves crunched beneath their boots. A storm was brewing overhead, but James didn't flinch. Someone had just tried to scare him off or worse, and they underestimated one thing. James Riley wasn't the kind of man you could intimidate, and with Odin by his side, he wasn't alone. The morning after the attack, James woke early, adrenaline still thrumming beneath his skin. His ribs ached, his knuckles were scraped raw, and his pickup was totaled. But worse than the pain was the silence, Fairview's cold, deliberate silence. The sheriff's warning echoed in his mind. Let it go. But James Riley had never been good at letting things go, especially not when people were trying to bury the truth. He poured black coffee into a tin mug, watching steam curl in the weak morning light. Odin sat by the door, eyes sharp, tail still. He hadn't slept much either. The dog had barely left James's side all night, pacing the perimeter like the war wasn't over. "You ready to work?" James asked. Odin stood immediately. They took the back trail through the woods behind the cabin, a winding path leading toward the hills. James didn't have a destination in mind. He needed space to think. But Odin's nose kept pulling him to the left, into the denser part of the forest, thicker pines, looser soil, and fewer signs of town life. A half-mile in, Odin stopped. He sniffed the air, then veered off the trail. "Odin?" James followed, brushing aside low-hanging branches. The shepherd moved in tight, controlled movements, nose to the ground, tail rigid, like he'd caught a scent trail no one else could have noticed. 50 yards deeper into the woods, Odin halted, at a half-buried mound beneath a tree, paws clawing at the dirt. James's gut tightened. "What is it, boy?" He knelt and helped clear the loose earth. After a few minutes of digging, something metallic glinted beneath the soil. James pulled it free, a backpack military issue. Torn, muddy and blood-stained. Inside, a waterlogged notebook, a smashed burner phone, and a single laminated ID badge. Charles Kincaid, DoD contractor, security level 3. James froze. His pulse hammered in his ears. It was Charlie's bag. Odin sat quietly, watching his handler. The forest was silent, oppressively so. James flipped open the notebook, carefully peeling the damp pages apart. Most of the writing was smeared or illegible, but a few words stood out. Council diverting funds, vet center was cover, development deal dirty, Trenton knows. Another line, near the bottom, if anything happens to me, this forest. Cabin Ridge, trust no one. James stared at the words until they blurred. Charlie hadn't left town. He'd been silenced, and whoever did it wanted to bury more than just a war hero's story. James returned to the cabin and laid out everything on the kitchen table. Odin paced nearby, his claws clicking against the wooden floor. He photographed every page, every item in the bag and saved it to a hard drive, not trusting the cloud. Then he buried the originals under a loose floorboard in the bedroom. It was a habit he'd picked up in Kandahar. When in doubt, prepare for betrayal. The next move had to be careful, quiet. But first, he needed to confirm the connection. James headed to the Fairview planning office that afternoon, Odin riding shotgun in a borrowed car. The receptionist gave him the same rehearsed smile as before, but this time James didn't bother asking. He walked straight past her and into the public records room, flipping through file cabinets until he found what he needed. Zoning development. Plans 2023. Trenton's name was everywhere, along with 3 other council members. They were planning to sell off public land, including the forest ridge behind James's cabin, to a private security contractor under the table, and the Veterans Center. It had been in the way, so they'd shut it down. James stepped back, the folder still in hand. Behind him, Odin growled low and deep. A shadow appeared in the reflection of the glass door. James turned slowly, muscles tensed. Someone had followed them inside. James didn't move. His reflection in the glass door caught the silhouette of a man just a few feet behind him, tall, broad-shouldered, standing too still to be casual. Odin's growl grew louder, more threatening. The shepherd's ears were flat, muscles coiled. One wrong move and James knew the dog would strike like a bullet. Slowly, James set the folder back on the shelf. "If you're here to talk," he said evenly, "you picked the wrong dog to sneak up on." "Easy, soldier," came the reply. Smooth, confident, the voice of someone who didn't rattle easily. "I'm not here to fight, but you're stirring up things you don't understand." James turned to face the man. He wore a charcoal suit, and a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Late 40s, ex-military by the way he stood. A small pin on his lapel gave him away. Stratos National Security, one of the largest private defense contractors in the country. James recognized it from his time overseas. They were everywhere. The government didn't want fingerprints. "You with Trenton?" James asked. The man didn't answer right away. "Let's just say I work with people who prefer stability. Fairview has a good thing going. We'd hate to see that threatened by someone with a hero complex." James's jaw clenched. "You threatening me?" "No," the man said. "I'm warning you, you've got no evidence, just some muddy old bag and the word of a man who disappeared. Charlie didn't just disappear, you buried him." The man stepped closer. "We offered him a choice. He made the wrong one." James's hand itched toward his sidearm, but he kept still. "You've served your country, honorably. Why not keep your peace, enjoy your quiet cabin and let this go?" James gave a cold smile. "Because the quiet didn't come free. Someone paid for it, and I don't forget debts." Odin barked, short and sharp. The man paused, eyeing the dog. Then he nodded once. "You won't get a second warning." He turned and walked out as calmly as he had entered. James stood frozen for a moment, then quickly snapped photos of the folder's contents, storing the files in a secure flash drive hidden inside his boot. He left the office 10 minutes later, checking every shadow on the way to his car. They were watching him now. Probably had been from the moment he came back. Back at the cabin, James ran his finger along the wooden table where he'd spread Charlie's. "Twiss?" "They're scared," he muttered. "If they weren't, they wouldn't be sending threats." Odin lay by the door, but his eyes stayed open, watching. James turned on the old radio tucked in the corner. Static filled the room, then cracked into a station, country music and weather updates. But James wasn't listening for songs. He was waiting for clicks, patterns. Surveillance tech often used hidden frequencies to piggyback on old analog bands. And, sure enough, between 2 songs he heard it. 3 rapid clicks. That pause. Then 2 more. Military code. Watching, listening, tracking. They'd bugged him. James stood, walked outside, and swept the cabin for surveillance, Odin close behind. 20 minutes later, he found the bug inside the chimney. Small, sophisticated, he crushed it under his boot. Enough was enough. He sat at his desk and pulled out a map of Fairview and the surrounding hills. He marked Charlie's last known movements, locations tied to the council's secret development, and the ridge where Odin had found the backpack. One point stood out, an old ranger station, long abandoned, near the edge of county lines. No cell, service, no nearby homes, and according to Charlie's notes, the meeting spot. James circled it in red ink. "They want me to stay quiet," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone. Odin's tail thumped once against the floor. "But I think it's time we paid them a visit." The road to the abandoned ranger station was long forgotten, overgrown with weeds and brush, as if the land itself wanted to hide what lay ahead. James drove as far as he could, then ditched the car near a dry creek bed. The rest he'd do on foot. Odin trotted beside him, silent, focused. They moved through the trees like ghosts. James had spent years doing recon in enemy territory, and old habits were hard to break. He stayed low, stepped only on solid ground to avoid crunching twigs, and scanned constantly for movement. Odin followed without a sound, nose working the air. An hour passed before they reached the old station, a squat concrete structure barely visible through thick pine cover. It was exactly as Charlie's notes had described. The building was supposed to have been condemned decades ago. Its windows were boarded, the roof partially caved in. But as James and Odin crept closer, he spotted signs that didn't belong. Fresh tire tracks, recent footprints in the mud. A security camera hidden in a birdhouse pointed toward the main path. This place wasn't abandoned. James took a long breath, drew his sidearm and signaled to Odin to stay behind as he circled wide to a side entrance. It was locked, modern padlock, not something from the 1970s. He examined the edges. Scorch marks. Someone had tried to burn this place at some point and failed. He crouched, picked the lock quietly, and slipped inside. The air inside was damp and metallic. The first room was empty, save for a rusted table and broken chair. But behind a false wall at the back, camouflaged with crumbling drywall, James found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. He clicked on his flashlight. Odin followed without hesitation. At the bottom, the space widened into what looked like a makeshift operations center. Newer construction, reinforced walls, a hum of generators somewhere behind the walls. Filing cabinets, hard drives, maps pinned to corkboards. But what caught James's eye was a wall lined with photographs, faces, men and women, veterans. Some he recognized. Some were labeled flagged in red ink. Others had X's drawn over them. At the center, Charlie Kincaid. Below his photo was a single phrase, "Subject breached protocol neutralized, do not reactivate." James's pulse surged. Charlie hadn't just stumbled into something. He'd uncovered a hit list, a list of veterans being silenced. And for what? He turned to the maps. Satellite overlays of Fairview and surrounding counties. Some areas were marked in red, labeled Phase 1 and Phase 2. A name appeared at the bottom corner, Stratos Urban Development, Civil Mill Integration Zones. This wasn't just about money or land. They were planning to build training facilities, covert ones on U.S. soil, using veteran rehab centers as covers. Those who asked too many questions? Flagged. Removed. A sudden noise behind him. A boot. Scuff. James dove behind a table as the door upstairs creaked open. Flashlights swept the room. "They found us," he whispered to Odin. The shepherd crouched beside him, eyes locked on the stairwell. 3 men came down, armed, voices low but urgent. "Secure the files. If he's here, we take him out. Quietly." James didn't wait. He hurled a chair into the far wall, shattering glass and drawing their attention. In the confusion, he moved fast and low, taking out the first guard with a chokehold, slamming him into a support beam. Odin launched at the second, knocking him to the ground before the man could fire. The third retreated up the stairs, shouting into a radio. James didn't chase. Instead, he grabbed what files he could, ripped a hard drive from the desk and shoved it into his pack. "Time to go, boy," he hissed. They climbed out the back, disappearing into the woods just as reinforcements arrived. Gunshots echoed behind them, trees splintering, but they didn't stop running, not until the trees closed behind them and the ranger station disappeared into the shadows. James knew now. He was marked. But he also knew something else. He had evidence. And, for the first time, the people trying to silence him should be afraid. Back at the cabin, James locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. Rain fell in sheets outside, thunder rolling low through the mountains. Odin lay by the hearth, panting from the long sprint, his flank still streaked with mud and burrs. James knelt beside him and whispered, "You did good, buddy." Odin gave a tired wag. James plugged the stolen hard drive into his old laptop. It whirred, the screen flickering before files began to appear, blueprints, emails, internal memos. Codenamed Silent Ember, the program outlined a partnership between Stratos National Security and select local governments to build covert training grounds across rural America, masked as rehabilitation centers for veterans. But they hadn't. Just wanted to disappear those who objected. They were testing behavioral control drugs, psychological manipulation, turning trauma into a tool. James stared at the screen, cold fury rising in his chest. Charlie had found out, and he'd paid with his life. James zipped up the laptop, slid the hard drive into a lead-lined pouch, and grabbed his coat. "Time to end this," he muttered. He didn't go to the sheriff this time. That door was closed. He went to someone he'd once trusted above all, Kate Morgan, his former commanding officer, now a state congressional aide, living 2 towns over. She'd been the one to write his transfer recommendation, the one who'd sent him letters in the hospital after his last tour. She was also one of the only people left he believed might still have a soul. They met at a quiet diner off Route 14. It was near empty, the kind of place where the waitress knows not to ask too many questions. Kate looked tired, older than James remembered, her blonde hair streaked with grey, but her eyes were still sharp. "I heard about Charlie," she said as soon as he sat. "You're the 3rd person this month to bring up his name." James slid the flash drive across the table. "This proves everything. They killed him, Kate, and they'll come for me next." She plugged it into her encrypted tablet. Her eyes darted across the screen as she scrolled. Reading line after line, James sipped his coffee, watching her. When she looked up, her face was unreadable. "This is big," she said. "I know." She hesitated, and then she stood up. "Come. With me," she said. They walked to her car. Odin followed, ears twitching. Kate opened the trunk, and that's when James saw it, a black duffel bag with the Stratos insignia. Military-grade comms, custom gear. She froze, caught mid-movement. "James," he drew his sidearm faster than most could blink. "Don't," he warned. "Not you." Kate raised her hands slowly. "I didn't want this. I swear. But they got to me. They said if I didn't help, they'd ruin my family, my career. You let them kill Charlie." "I didn't know," she shouted. "Not until it was too late. I thought they were just watching him. I didn't think they'd—" James stepped back, heart pounding. "You fed them everything, didn't you? Where I was, when I'd dig, who I'd meet." Kate didn't deny it. Her face was breaking. "I tried to stop it," she whispered. "They don't just come after you. They erase you, your record, your family's future, everything. I thought if I could keep them close, I could protect you." Odin growled low, moving between James and Kate. James stared at her. Everything inside him felt hollow. "I came here for help," he said, "and you were the one person I thought I could trust." Kate nodded, eyes glistening. "Then let me fix it." She handed him the flash drive back. "I still have contacts, journalists, people outside the system. But we need time, hours at most. You can't go back to the cabin. They're already on their way." James clenched his jaw. "Then we'd better move fast." As they climbed into separate vehicles and sped off into the night, James glanced. Back once at the diner through the storm-blurred window, he knew what came next wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be war. The warehouse was cold, abandoned, and isolated, perfect for what they needed. Kate had secured it through an old contact at a freight company who owed her favors. No cameras, no neighbors, just shadows, concrete, and echoes. James paced inside while Kate set up the satellite uplink. Odin stood watch by the bay door, alert, tail rigid like a tripwire. "They'll know we're transmitting the second the signal goes live," James said. Kate nodded without looking up. We only need 5 minutes. Long enough to dump everything. Files, photos, hard drive contents. The journalist on the other end is clean. Lives off-grid. Won't scare easy. James exhaled. He wasn't scared. He was ready. Outside, the wind howled through rusted gutters. A storm was rolling in again, fitting. It had started in the rain. It would end that way too. Uploading, Kate said, tapping keys. A red progress bar blinked to life. 1%? 3%? 5%? James turned to Odin. If anything happens to me, he whispered, scratching behind the shepherd's ears, you run. You hear me? You don't wait. Odin nuzzled him, then returned to the door. The signal climbed, 15%, 22%. Then the lights flickered. A split second later, Odin barked, twice, sharp, urgent. They were here. James grabbed his rifle and nodded. To Kate, keep it going. No matter what, she handed him an earpiece. You'll hear when it hits 100. Then she locked the laptop behind a steel case and threw a signal booster onto the roof through a hatch. It would take more than bullets to stop the upload now. Sati, first black SUV screeched to a halt outside, then another. James dropped to a knee, watching from the shadows. 4 men in tactical gear spread out, military grade, suppressors, trained. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to erase. He waited until they breached the threshold. Then he opened fire. The first fell before he even knew where the shot came from. The second ducked, but caught a round in the leg. Chaos erupted, shouts, ricochets, flashlights, sweeping wildly. Odin launched forward, teeth bared, tackling the third before he could fire. The man screamed as Odin tore the rifle from his hands and dragged him down. James took cover behind a pillar, reloaded, and picked off the fourth through. A narrow gap between crates. For a moment, silence. Then, boom. An explosion rocked the far side of the building. A diversion. More were coming. Odin whimpered, hit. A graze along his back leg. Not deep, but enough to slow him. James scooped him up behind cover. Stay down, soldier, just a little longer. He could hear them regrouping outside. A voice called out over a megaphone, James Ashford, you have 10 seconds to surrender the files and come out. You won't get another chance. James looked toward Kate. She was bleeding from her arm but still typing. 97%, she said, eyes locked on the screen. James grabbed a flare from his belt and cracked it to life. Then he sprinted toward the front, threw it out the main door, and ducked out the side just as gunfire erupted on the decoy. Back inside, Kate shouted, 100%. The signal turned green. She hit send to all. A storm of emails, encrypted packets, cloud storage mirrors. The truth had been unleashed. Impossible to stop now. James and Odin regrouped with her near the exit. From outside came shouts of confusion. Then sirens. Real ones. Kate's contact had tipped off the Federal Watchdog Office once the upload finished. A dozen unmarked vehicles pulled in fast. Government issue. Men in suits and windbreakers shouting orders. FBI. Internal Affairs. Military Intelligence. Stratos' men tried to scatter, but it was too late. They were caught red-handed. James stood, still as headlights washed over him. Hands raised. Odin limped beside him, growling low. A federal agent approached. James Ashford? He nodded. We've been expecting you. 2 weeks later, James stood before a crowd at the Fairview Town Hall. News vans surrounded the building. People held signs, Justice for Charlie. Truth matters. Thank you, James and Odin. Kate stood beside him, arm in a sling, no longer afraid. The mayor, disgraced, had resigned. The town council was under federal investigation. Stratos, facing lawsuits and congressional hearings, but none of that mattered more than this. The truth had survived. And Odin, he sat proudly by James's side, medal around his neck, tail wagging at the applause. They had tried to silence a war hero, but his German shepherd had other plans.